Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. My name is Deepa Majumdar, and I teach philosophy at PNW, Purdue Northwest. I'm the coordinator of this series called Race, Racism, Anti-Racism. Our event today, which is the second last for this academic year, titled Race, Gender, and the 2020 Elections, is a presentation by Dr. Nadia Brown from Purdue West Lafayette, followed by a Q&A by PNW Professor Dr. Lee Arts, and our moderator is Dr. Karen B. Morris. I'd like to start with a dedication of this series to victims of racist violence from the police and others. Although our focus is the African American experience, we're concerned about other groups as well, like Asian Americans and other vulnerable groups, which include whites and police officers, given yesterday's tragedy. On Tuesday, March 16, 2021, 8 people were shot dead in 3 separate spas in the metropolitan area of Atlanta, Georgia, by a 21-year-old white gunman. 6 of the 8 killed were of Asian descent, 7 were women, and the shootings took place in businesses owned by Asian Americans. 1 person was wounded. Where police violence towards African Americans is concerned, in 2020 alone, police shot and killed over 800 people, of whom almost 20% were Black youth, meaning at a disproportionate rate. It is unfortunate that we have a pool of victims to choose from. This should not be the case. Everyone knows of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor because they have made the national news, but closer to home, we have Sean Reed killed in Indianapolis in May 2020, Rashad Cunningham in Gary in August 2019, and Eric Logan in South Bend, June 2019. We dedicate this series of lecture discussions to the memories of all who lost their lives to racialized violence and in protest of their killings by police and others. Since the brutal killing of George Floyd, millions of Americans and people in other countries have been shocked and outraged. Hundreds of protests have been held, perhaps the largest demonstrations against racism since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The purpose of this Zoom-based series, featuring monthly presentations by scholars, journalists, and civic representatives addressing multiple aspects of racism and anti-racism, is to sympathize with the times and current protests against racism, to provide extracurricular education on race, racism, and anti-racism, and to focus on Western racism, domestic and international, especially the African-American experience, while recognizing that racism exists in many countries worldwide. We have many people to thank for this faculty-driven series. In particular, our guest speaker today, Dr. Nadia Brown. Earlier, we circulated her paper at Purdue Northwest. We have Chancellor Keon and Provost Holford to thank for funding this series. Sue Bremer, Catherine Olson, and Chris Falzone, who helped with the media coverage. PNW Office of Information Technology and our audiovisual experts, Jason Jeffress and Greg Collins. James Seidler and Jamie Eggert, who helped create our webpage. My colleagues who helped plan this series, especially Dr. Karen B. Morris, Lee Arts, Kim Sipes, Meeta Chaudhary, and Colette Morrow. Above all, we thank you who are in the audience. There are so many things you could be doing at this hectic point in the semester, and here you are because you are concerned and committed and interested in the issue of anti-racism. We welcome you cordially to our remaining event for the current academic year, which is on April 19th. Dr. Meeta Chaudhary will do a presentation titled The 1619 Project, #Summer 2020. Registration is not required, but strongly recommended. Please bear with us if we have any kind of power outage or any other technical glitch. We have not had any so far. The gods are with us. We are relying on Zoom technology. We hope nothing will happen. I would now like to introduce Dr. Bishop Morris, who is our moderator for today's discussion. She is an associate professor of English at PNW. She's a frequent invited speaker / panelist on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has received awards for her work on diversity. Dr. Bishop Morris will now take over.
Thank you, Professor Majumdar, especially for the moment of pause to recognize and reflect upon the Black lives lost through racialized police violence, the Asian lives lost through senseless gun violence, and the lives lost in the recent mass shooting in Colorado. These recurring incidences of violence reflect a chilling reality. Over 200 voting rights laws are under attack in 43 states. If successful, Georgians will not be able to register to vote and vote in the same day in a country where one can apply and purchase a gun to kill 8 innocent human beings in the same day. This series has dedicated itself to unpacking the structural racism that creates such conditions, and we will continue that work today in the context of legislative decision-making amongst Black women with the help of an extraordinary political scientist, Dr. Nadia E. Brown. I would ask the audience to keep in mind that the Black experience is not monolithic, and we should be mindful not to essentialize the Black experience. The Black community is a diverse community, and Black citizens represent every position and perspective, education level, economic strata. The tie that binds us all, especially those who struggle in the face of racial disparities, racial profiling, racism in any form, is that we share the human condition. I am so excited for Dr. Brown to share insights on identity politics and legislation, but first, a few housekeeping matters. Number one, a reminder that we are recording, and so if your preference is not to have your name or countenance visible on the screen at any time, then we invite you to view this presentation on Facebook, or a link to the recording will be made available approximately 1 week post-event. Lastly, the views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the persons appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Purdue University Northwest, the PNW faculty organizers, or others who may be associated with its production. Attendees are highly encouraged to post questions in the chat at any time throughout the programs. And now we're ready to get into what promises to be a riveting lecture, followed by an interview and, of course, Q&A. Dr. Brown will be interviewed by someone who is no stranger to this series, PNW Professor of Media Studies, Lee Artz. Artz is a professor and researcher of transnational media, democracy, and the public sphere, and depictions of race, nationality, and the globalization of entertainment. Professor Artz has published 12 books, numerous articles and chapters, and also serves as the host of PNW's Roundtable Perspectives. Thank you, Lee, for lending your time and talents to today's conversation. And without further ado, it is truly my honor and pleasure to introduce Nadia E. Brown. Dr. Nadia E. Brown earned her PhD at Rutgers University, and she is a university faculty scholar and associate professor of political science and African American studies at Purdue University. She specializes in Black women's politics and holds a graduate certificate in women's and gender studies. Dr. Brown's research interests lie broadly in identity politics, legislative studies, and Black women's studies. While trained as a political scientist, her scholarship on intersectionality seeks to push beyond disciplinary constraints to think more holistically about the politics of identity. She is the author or editor of several award-winning books, including Sisters in the State House, Black Women in Legislative Decision-Making, Oxford University Press, Distinct Identities, Minority Women in U.S. Politics, with Sarah Allen Gershon, Routledge Press, The Politics of Protest, Readings on the Black Lives Matter Movement, also Routledge Press, Approaching Democracy, American Government in Times of Challenge, also Routledge Press. Professor Brown is the lead editor of Politics, Groups, and Identities, a journal, and Professor Brown is part of the hashtag #MeTooPoliSci collective, where she spearheads efforts to stop sexual harassment in the discipline. In July 2021, Dr. Brown will be a full professor of government and director of women's and gender studies at Georgetown University. Professor Brown lives outside of Indianapolis, Indiana, with her husband, 3 young daughters, her mother, and their dog, Ziggy. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Nadia E. Brown. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. This is such an honor to be able to talk about my research and really a forward look to the 2020 election and the ramifications, but also to share space with you all as we are living through, yet another, crisis that centers on identity politics. I think that the introduction that Deepa gave and the further thoughts that Karen added really helped to center the importance of this work and hopefully what universities can do and continue to do to be on the forefront and the cutting edge of trying to use our scholarship as a way to curtail white supremacy and violence towards marginalized communities. Thank you to the organizers for having me. And I've seen some friends in the audience today. So hello, thank you for supporting. And for all of you that have thought it not robbery today to come and participate, given the crazy time that it is in the semester. So I'm going to talk to you today about race, gender, and the 2020 election. So some of this is a postpartum look, and then some of this is a forward look. The details from my talk come from an article that was published in the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Politics that was circulated earlier. It's entitled Glass Half Full, Cautious Optimism and the Future of Black Women and Political Elites in America. And this is a co-authored article with Sarah Allen Vershawn at Georgia State University. So this is a quote from a mashup of words that Ayanna Pressley, the first Black woman to represent Massachusetts in the federal legislature, and Alvador Gillespie, who was a woman who ran for office unsuccessfully in Minnesota, and right after George Floyd was murdered, decided that she needed to run. This is her quote. "We bring a different perspective to politics as Black women. We have the ability and the tendency to look out for everyone. We're connected with people who are closest to the pain in the ways that other politicians probably are not." And this quote, again, a mashup of things that others have said, but it is it's the ways in which Black women politicians were, and lay people alike, right, were entering into politics in 2020. We're seeing that there was a real need for a change in politics because of the hurt that people felt. Indeed, many women and Black women in Minnesota said that when George Floyd called out for his mother in his dying breath, they took that as a call to action. And for some, it meant run for elected office. So 2020 was the year of the Black woman candidate. This is something that was underreported or kind of noticed because of all the craziness of the circus of the 2020 election. But what we saw was that there was a record number of Black women running, and particularly women of color, not just Black women, that were running as Republicans. Again, a very underreported story given all that was going on in 2020. But what received a lot of attention was Kamala Harris's historic nomination to later become the first woman vice president, the first woman of South Indian descent and African American or Jamaican descent. So to place this into context, right, it's not just yay, we have so many more women running and there's some women running and winning, but I really want to understand the ways that women run, they face different challenges and opportunities. So it's understanding both the how and the why. And this is a question that requires political scientists to really use an intersectional lens. And what this means is taking the holistic identity of a candidate, not just looking at her race or her gender, right? But understanding the ways in which race and gender are mutually constituted. We know that 2020 saw the persistence of racial inequalities, most notably the number of deaths due to COVID-19 to communities of color, particularly Black women who saw disproportionate amounts of evictions and homelessness in 2020 with the economic downturn. And then also in the summer of racial reckoning, right, that there were just much more attention paid to the persistence of racial inequalities. I think the pandemic made things more apparent. They were always there. Maxine Waters has famously said that Black America is living with a pandemic within a pandemic, and pointing to the fact that racism really cuts across all the kind of disparities that Black Americans face, whether it's in health, economics, employment, education. And then, so 2020 was just, again, this year of monumental inequality that was made ever present. And unlike other years, we were all at home, right? Most of us, or should have been, right, all at home because of COVID-19. And you're, listening to the news stories, reading the news, and you're seeing these things, right? It was very difficult to hide and to say that we don't live in a society that is bifurcated by the haves and the have-nots along racial and gendered lines. What I want to talk to you today about is 2020 as a long time in the making, right? That we are celebrating 2020, we celebrated 2020 as the year of the Black woman candidate, but this doesn't come out of nowhere, right? So I want to contextualize this. Second, I ask, will 2020 be the year of the Black woman elected official? And I'll kind of give some highlights from scholarship that I've written to kind of say that, let's how to hedge our bets here. And then I'll give some good and bad news for Black women candidates and office holders and point to some ways that future scholarship can address both inequities within the academy and also in larger society. So let's start with the bad news first, because we get to the good news last, right? Maybe leave off with the good news part. So when Black women are running for office, they face challenges that are unique to them because of their racial and gendered identities. Research shows that they're less likely to be recruited to run for office. And then when they are recruited, that doesn't usually come with the kind of perks of being recruited. We know that women of color in general, but particularly Black women, face real challenges when it comes to fundraising. They are out fundraised many times over, and that they usually have to have multiple fundraisers to collect small amounts of money because they're not linked into the networks of big donors. Black women also talk about a very deep dissatisfaction with the political process. In one of my interviews with women that were running in the Texas state legislature, actually broke down and cried, right? That this was so deeply emotionally upsetting, the ways in which the Democratic Party did not take them seriously and refused to support their candidacies, and just giving basically that they felt the election away to Republicans as opposed to really trying to build up a stronghold of Democrats in that district. And they saw that not just as a partisan issue, but they wondered if this would have been the same if it was a candidate from a different background. And then I have some work with a co-author, Daniel Levy, that's forthcoming, that shows that Black women face both racialized and gendered challenges on the campaign trail. And so unfortunately, political science literature is still caught in this either or kind of category. So we're looking at things that as gender-based or things that are race-based. But what we find is that Black women, by definition of their multiple identities, face really distinct challenges, right? And some of them have to do with what they look like. So Black women with natural hair, like mine and locks, are read in very distinct ways, sometimes as being more nationalistic or combative, or having a much more kind of sapphire personality, sapphire stereotype personality. And they see these things on the campaign trail because of their phenotype, things that they can't change, right? The kind of texture and curl pattern of their hair. So the good news. So we know that for a very long time, Black women have been the fastest growing demographic group among political elites. If you look over the number of women that are running successfully for office, particularly in the Northeast and the Midwest, the rise in the number of women candidates and elected officials really is coming from Black women and women of color. Republican women, unfortunately, are pretty monolithic, and they're less likely to win office, but those that do are overwhelmingly white women. The growth of women in politics comes from the Democratic side, wholly comes from Black women who are running. Black women display higher levels of political ambition than white women. They're more likely to say, something needs to be done, like the opening quote that I showed you, and I'm going to run myself, and not waiting to check off all the boxes. Did I get the law degree? Did I have this internship, right? They're saying a problem needs to be fixed, and I'm going to do this. And then other research with my forever co-author, Sarah Gershon, we find that Black women have a very distinct campaign style where they draw on multiple identities, which allows them to bring in bigger coalitions, right? So they can talk to women's group as a woman, and get that vote. They're also able to talk to racialized groups and get that vote as a racialized group by understanding the differences and challenges that those communities face. So turning to 2021, right, and kind of the next 4 years, will this be kind of the year of the elected official? So here's the good news, right? We know that when people of color, particularly women of color, Black women, are elected, they bring different kind of policy interests and style and legislative styles to legislative office. And that is so necessary and so needed. They're oftentimes bringing a perspective that was overlooked, not necessarily because of malice, just because no one was in the state house that looked like them or had those experiences. So I'll give you some examples in these two kind of big policymaking arenas that I have here. The Violence Against Women Act. We know that women of color, particularly Black women, were more likely to talk about people that were left out of the initial reauthorizations of the Violence Against Women Act. And some of those people happened to share identities of Black women. So there were new amendments or pushes to the bill that would include people who were unmarried but were living in domestic situations and experienced spousal or intimate partner abuse. But those people that were unmarried experiencing abuse could also refer to queer Americans who were unable to be married during some of the parts of the Violence Against Women Act. Women of color, particularly Black women, spoke up about tribal women who were on reservations in tribal country, who were seeing huge numbers of domestic violence. But because of federal and tribal laws, that there was just this gap in being able to support these kind of victims and survivors. Black women brought that to the table. This new book I have with Daniel Lemmy, Sister Style, where we look at the politics of appearance of Black women elected officials. We see that the Crown Act is a prime example of how Black women come to the table to address policy issues that would otherwise be unaddressed if they weren't there. So for example, discriminating against someone based on their hairstyle, their hair texture, is prohibited in 20 locations, right? Whether that's through states, municipalities, or counties. And it's now this act is making its way through the federal government, hopefully. It's been introduced in the House and hopefully it'll make it to the Senate. But this was a bill started by a Black woman, Holly Mitchell in California, who recognized that there were just an undue number of Black children who were being put out of school because of their hairstyles. There were Black women who were being fired from positions because their hair did not keep up with the corporate brand, or that the military was mandating that Black women should not be allowed to wear their hair in certain protective hairstyles. So these are all examples of things that Black women bring to the policymaking table. So the bad news, right? So we know that Black women do provide such an integral role in policy making, but instead when they enter into legislative institutions, those institutions are racialized and gendered. And it's because people make up the institution, right? People make up the laws and the norms of that institution. And so legislative bodies, just like society writ large, also bear with it racism and sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, right, classism. And so an example in one of my research projects, a woman told me that she was the first person who pushed to have a women's bathroom on the floor in the Maryland State Legislature. Women had been in the legislature for almost, I think, 10 years by the time that she made this request, but they felt, some of these older women that were in the legislature felt like this was a claim they couldn't make, although their male colleagues had a bathroom, right, a men's only bathroom on the floor. That's kind of in some ways trivial, but it shows the ways that there are groups of people that are excluded, and not necessarily out of malice, just was there weren't large numbers of women that were in elected offices. And so that the things in the legislature didn't keep up to including new people. And so we see all this, right, more recently with women who are given birth in office. We've seen this now with Ilhan Omar to wear the hijab while she's on the floor of the House of Representatives, things that Congress just didn't have to deal with because it was pretty monolithic, pretty white male. We also know from literature that women of color and Black women in particular say that they have feelings of inadequacy or inequity in the legislature, that even when they achieve seniority and position, they are still seen as less influential. And all of these things matter because it's not just the people that are behaving in ways that might be biased or prejudiced towards Black women, but it's also the institutions, its norms, and its structures itself that prohibit women and Black women in particular. So where do we go from here, right? There has to be this glass half full. So what Sarah and I do in this project is we advocate for women in politics on two fronts, right? It's both within the academy, so how we are teaching about women of color in American politics, particularly Black women, and then what's happening in electoral politics. So first, the Diane Pender-Hughes administration had a report almost over 10 years ago, probably close to 11 years now, when she called for political science to really enter into the 21st century, recognizing that by 2050, the United States will be a majority minority country, and that as educators, we will be teaching more Black and brown students, and we need to reflect they need to see themselves reflected in our scholarship. We also need to be asking kind of different questions that take seriously the role of diversity, of inclusion, and equity in ways that political science, unfortunately, has not, in order to stay relevant as a discipline. Next, my work shows that we need an intersectional lens. It's not enough to look at Black women political elites or any group of people as solely one identity, right? That there are multiple overlapping identities that mediate how people experience politics and how the world views them and treats them through a political lens. And I argue to do that, that means you have to banish the dummy variable, right? So for political scientists, we love a really complicated regression model, some fancy math. And sometimes you just go ahead and talk to people, right? Sometimes you need to just go ahead and say, I am not going to equate people's lived experiences to a 0 or 1, right? To a number so they could be read in Stata or R or some kind of fancy physical package. Because what that does is it loses the complexity of how people experience politics and act politically. So what I end with is that I think that there is a historic and future role of Black women in American politics. I'll leave with the example of Stacey Abrams, who right now is seeing all the shine as helping to turn Georgia blue, or even just for one election cycle, doing her grassroots activism work, getting out voters through Fair Fight and the New Georgia Project. But the skills and things that she did were very reminiscent to other Black women in American politics who pushed for the expansion of the electorate, like Fannie Lou Hamer, right? And who educated voters, who had voter registration drives, who met voters where they were. And those are the same things that, that Stacey Abrams is doing now. Similar to Fannie Lou Hamer, right? We're seeing kind of like this rollback of electoral rights in politics. Right now, the Georgia state legislature is an all Republican, pretty much it's a Republican dominated legislature. It's a supermajority. The governor's Republican. Both houses are Republican. And they're opposed to pass legislation that will really curtail ways that marginalized communities vote. Not just Democrats, right? But people with disabilities, those that speak English as a second language, those that work and can't get to the election polls, our military officers, right? This is one of these most restrictive policies. And like Fannie Lou Hamer, Stacey Abrams is trying to use her platform to show the undemocratic way that some state legislatures are trying to roll back voting protections. So I'll stop there. I look forward to your questions and comments. This is my email address, and you can always reach me on all social media platforms. I'm Brown PhD Girl. Again, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I would encourage everybody on your Zoom page to click the speaker view so that when Dr. Brown speaks, you can see her primarily and not the other 60 beautiful faces that are out there. I'm almost reluctant to start this interview, Dr. Brown, because I've taken to heart what Dr. Bishop Morris said at the beginning, that we shouldn't essentialize any particular identity, including a Black identity. And I'm just coming off a presentation with several Black Lives Matter activists, one of whom explained that getting shot by a Black cop or tased by a Black cop didn't make it less painful. So I guess my question is, how does this identity solve the problem of political program?
So I don't think it solves the problem at all, right? Instead, what I'm arguing for is a more expansive view of deliberative democracy, and that there needs to be many more people and voices at the table. I'm an expert in Black women's politics, and I know the benefit that Black women bring to electoral politics. And so that's my advocacy role as a scholar, but I also would advocate for members of other groups that have been marginalized in politics to seek electoral politics. And also that when there's more people of marginalized groups, they're no longer tokenized in the same way or stereotyped or fitting into these kind of essentialist ideals. And that happens when we only have a select few, right? So so my quest, right, is not to have a select few. It's not to have like kind of this tokenized view for the political project, but actually to have a much more expansive voice. I think it's better for a democracy that way.
Well, again, it's very difficult for me, being in the social position I am, to ask some of these questions. So I'm going to channel some of the other people that have suggested this. I know when Kamala Harris was picked, as you said, it seemed like a historic measure, the first Black woman vice president. But there was an immediate response that she put more Black men in prison in California than any previous attorney general. That Kamala Harris was opposed to investigating police shootings, that she was opposed to reducing the crowding in jails because she said it would let too many Black young men back on the streets. She fined and jailed the mothers that heard George Floyd, but in California, she fined them and jailed them for truancy of their children. I mean, I understand that we want a more expansive, but it seems like there's a real tight vetting of who will be the representatives that are allowed in to the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris is a prime case.
Yes, I can answer or respond to your query in two ways. So, so Kamala Harris was not the choice for many progressives, right? When Joe Biden vowed that he would pick a woman VP in the late spring, early summer, a lot of folks were excited, right? And Kamala was not maybe the most exciting person on the top of his list. But she fits a lot of the things that he needed, right? So at a time when we're dealing with the racial reckoning, we were dealing with anti-Asian bias and violence, right? Picking a Black woman who is both Black and South Asian was doing, was fitting a role that he needed. But also, she's a moderate like him, right? We can't think that because she is a Black woman that she will have more progressive viewpoints, right? Like she's a wholly moderate with maybe perhaps a twinkling of some progressivism, but she's really a moderate. And the other thing that I'll note is that some of those claims are just factually inaccurate, that that indeed she never locked up mothers. It was a threat. I'm not saying that it was right or not, and I'm not a stand for Kamala. I'm just trying to correct the record. And so what we saw this summer was really a concerted disinformation campaign that was targeted to try to keep Black voters home, right? So Kamala Harris was supposed to really turn up the vote, right? Particularly for Black and brown communities who wanted to see themselves represented in her. Also women, right? And there were concerted efforts to slander her, right? And I think, unfortunately, what happened this summer was that the campaign and her team didn't get out in front and to be able to really speak with people who held these views about her.
Yeah, I think that we can always expect there will be some moderate representative of some underrepresented group that is vetted again by the Democratic Party. And so when we're looking for representation, or as you say, expanding democracy, it seems that finding the candidates that will be tolerable by the Bidens, and then, although you say you're not defending, it certainly sounds like that. I mean, Biden said he's not in favor of defunding cops, and he thinks cops should shoot people in the knee. So that's progressiveness. So instead of having dead, we'll have wounded and paralyzed people. That it just strikes me as a very limited perspective. And it's not just Kamala Harris. I mean, we started this whole series with Glenn Ford from the Black Agenda Report that has made a very strong argument that the Congressional Black Caucus does not represent the Black community, that they're not even in favor of social justice, and he claims that they have no conscience. And then he proceeds to go down the 46 members that are in the Congressional Black Caucus to note that they support Israel's killing of Palestinians, that none of them came out in opposition to the invasion that Israel did, nor were they in opposition to the US war against Libya. None of them have spoken out on the genocide against millions in the Congo. So to say, well, this expands it, again, it's like there's always a moderate woman or a moderate Hispanic or a moderate Black that will ask basically the power structure, let me in and I will make it better for you. But it kind of removes any opportunity to make a social change when these are the people that we rely upon.
So as a scholar, and not, and not editorializing or giving my own perspective on who I voted for and how I voted, right? So I think right, I'm towing this fine line, right, of being able to objectively try, to try to say what the scholarship says and what my own scholarship has done, right, and it's added to the conversation, and how it applies to real world politics. I'm not making, I'm not advocating for or against the politician, but in yet, thematize, using themes to be able to show what my research finds and what Black women, by and large, bring to the table. But I will say this, right? There have always been contestations within communities. And unfortunately, because of how race has become salient in the United States around group identities, Black Americans are expected to be much more homogeneous than other groups, right? And this is not just like a social process, right? This is a legal practice as well, right? When the government gets to define who's Black by having one drop of Black blood, regardless of your connections to Blackness or Black communities, that there is an homogenizing effect of Blackness. Michael Dawson and Catherine Tate have written about the ways that Black communities come together to vote in particular ways that sometimes support their economic interests, sometimes support their social interests, but all the time they're trying to think through racialized interests. So sometimes what might be good for Black America as a whole is detrimental to my own individual interests. And so we see these tensions being played out, but it's because there is this expectation that Black people should be on one political team, right? And that others who don't are somehow less Black, or they are not deserving of their Black card, right? So I push back against it, right? There's always been differences among them, right? And everyone is entitled to their opinion. I do think that it's important to have full information and to have, again, like as a scholar, to have the tools, the analytical tools to kind of distill down what's true, what isn't true, and then kind of how it could be read. And so the point's right about the Congressional Black Caucus. There have been, numerous studies about the ways that the Congressional Black Caucus may not be representing progressive interests, right? I don't think it's synonymous to say that they are Black interests, but I think that they could say progressive interests or social justice issues, right? And so we saw earlier this week, or was it last week? I don't know, pandemic time, nothing makes sense anymore. But the Congressional Black Caucus, right, has put forth the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And Black Lives Matter activists, the Movement for Black Lives, have come back and said that doesn't go far enough. We really want the Breathe Act. And so you saw this very vocal split among, what's the best way? Do you incrementally kind of change Black politics or policing the lens of Black politics, or do you overhaul the whole system, right? And kind of defund the police and invest in, and take that money and invest in Black communities, right? Those are policy questions, right? And I think those are the things that we should be having. It doesn't behoove any community to be wholly on one side and not be able to see the gradations of gray and nuance in a policy, right? And unfortunately, right, elected officials aren't activists, right? That's not their job. Their job is to move the needle, and how policy is made is incrementally. And so I'm, again, not taking up for any political party or group, but basically sharing my position as a scholar to kind of reframe the question that you posed, Lee.
I think what you've just said is a way of understanding this, because I think, as you said, it's not a question of Black representation or these people are supposed to represent the entire Black community, but it's a question of policy and program. And then it becomes a question of what is the job of people that are elected to office, and is it to move the needle incrementally, or is it actually an opportunity or a responsibility to address the structures of racism or sexism in this country? And I would argue that the reason for being in the Democratic Party is to make sure that that needle doesn't get moved very far. Mm-hmm. That is their, objectively speaking, I would argue that is their historic purpose. I mean, if we think about things like the Voting Rights Act or school desegregation or the end of Jim Crow or open housing, none of those things happened when there was a representative in Congress. They all happened from a massive social movement for civil rights and equality. After that, we had lots of Black elected officials, and you can, objectively speaking, you can have a chart that shows the more Black elected officials there are, the less there are social movements, social protests, any kind of organized activity, up until George Floyd, well, probably Ferguson. So what they've done, objectively speaking, with the data would show that when John Lewis stopped leading SNCC and became a Democrat, advances for progressive interests like voting rights, like equality of education, like even something as simple as a $15 wage. And the Black female mayor of Baltimore vetoed that. So I'm just suggesting, I'm not the one that's essentializing this. I think that's who he's being essentialized, is claiming if we have more of these people without looking at their politics, will be progressive. It's just not, as you say, objectively verifiable.
Yeah, so I push back, right? I think that there are two jobs here, right? So the job of elected official is not to be an outside agitator. Sometimes having someone on the inside is able to stop bad bills from being signed and put into place. And I think you need a both and strategy. I don't think it's an either or. I think to protect marginalized people in the United States and worldwide, there has to be a both and. Research from, I don't do this work, but colleagues that do work on Republican women in the 1990s have showed that the contract with America could have been so much worse if there were not moderate Republicans that kind of walk stuff back. I couldn't imagine what that would be. My own research says that having Black elected officials changes the kind of dynamics of policies that are on the table, and having their voice there enables better policies to be written, right? And it's a blind spot that, again, sometimes they're malicious and sometimes they're not, that having people at the table is better because they have, they're able to kind of change the agenda. But I think the part that you're getting at is, right, the lack of sustained social justice movements in the United States. And then I would ask, right, respectfully, think about why is that, right? It's not that any of these issues have gone away, right? That we've been dealing with poverty since the beginning of America, right? Before America was even a thing. We've been dealing with domestic violence and issues of racism, right? That's as baked into America as apple pie. But what's changed, right, is the way that we as the public view legitimate protest movements, right, or likelihoods to join into those. There's less sympathy for some groups than for others. There's also a lack of infrastructure, right, in some of these organizations. Some things have been co-opted by political parties or by politicians, right? But I think it needs a holistic kind of view. So we can think about Occupy Wall Street as an idea, right? So similar to Black Lives Matter, it was decentralized. There was no central figure of a leader of this movement. They had real challenges around a collective message, particularly given racial and gendered inequities, and they fizzled out. But they also were kind of bought out by big money interests, right? Who were talking to Americans and saying that, oh, these are radicals who want to redistribute wealth, right? And so they're dealing with their own internal problems. And then there's outside forces that are shining a light on this and turning American public opinion. The same thing, right, through social justice around policing, right? We have been so immune to seeing Black people killed that when there are bills and policies around this, there's enough slander out there that gets everyday Americans to think that Black Lives Matter were the ones who were actively leading like the insurrection on January 6th, right? It was led by, Black Lives Matter is against the nuclear family, right? All of these lies are being spewed, and there's not many people who are able to stand up and legitimately have trusted, the American public has trusted that will confront these things, right? And so it's not, I think it's just having a much more expansive and holistic view and not thinking it's a one or the other, and also understanding the reasons and rationale why these things have failed in some ways.
Yeah, I'm just reminded of the Princeton study by Gillens and his colleague that said that the US Congress and policymakers do not represent the interests of the American public. They had a longitudinal study over decades that found that what the American people want is never what Congress has addressed. And they say it's because of corporate money, like you say, which also influences how the media reports on these things. But I would suggest that it's not like the movements have gone away. I mean, 26 million people, right. Presumably the largest demonstrations in the history of the United States, came out in protest against the killing of George Floyd, including in little towns not far from here that were all white. So I think it's been a combination of many factors, but one of them is when people believe something's going to be addressed, like with Obama being president, or when we get, Mayor Lightfoot elected mayor of Chicago, that somehow things will happen, and it usually goes south. And, right. And so I appreciate when you keep saying expand the discussion, expand the conversation. I'm just wondering if that doesn't mean also expand the political options that we have. And recognizing that the Democratic Party is very intent on not allowing other voices to be heard and to be
absolutely right. I think you're onto something, right? So we have a two-party system, and I think the way that our government is set up, we will never have a multi-party system, right? That my scholarly belief. But what this means is that groups are captured by a political party, right? And the Democratic Party has a reason to seek out voters and candidates, Black candidates and voters. The Republican Party does not, right? And we see this now the Republican Party has become writ large the party of Trump, that they've doubled down on racism and white supremacy. They don't have policy prescriptions. And there are Black Republicans, right? I've studied many in my own research who are pushing the party because they believe in social conservatism, right? They believe in the in liberty and kind of like this libertarian view of justice, right? Yeah. Right, but not the stand on racial politics and policy. But what we don't have, right, the party is not supporting them, right? Like the party is not trying to push them up and to propagate them. And also voters aren't necessarily wanting to vote for some of these candidates. Now that could be the candidates themselves, right? Some of them are flawed and all the other reasons. But I think anytime that you have a two-party system and one group is captured, that there's no fighting over the middle, that both parties aren't trying to compete for them. For my students, I tell them, it's like if you're single and two people are vying for your attention for a date, you feel like you get the chance to choose, right? But if you only have that one option for a date, you might say, I just have to go with the person who wants to go with me, even though I would rather go with someone else. And even unfortunately,
if that person's an abuser.
Especially that person.
In this case, I would argue the Democratic Party is the one date, but it's an abusive date.
Or it's the person who tells you, I'm sorry, shows up with flowers the next day, but then forgets something really bad the next day, right? So, it's just, you don't have options. We could be having this conversation. This conversation can look radically different if the US were a multi-party system. This conversation could look completely different if we were a party that had quotas based on race, based on region, based on gender, based on religion, right? We don't. And because of that, right, I think some of the kind of pitfalls that we come to around identity politics, again, are baked into the system, right? It's in a system that was really not set up for marginalized groups to really exercise much control.
Yep. And I didn't mean to leave this all on the question of representation from the Black community, because I think many of my observations could also be made with women political leaders, starting with Hillary Clinton or Madeleine Albright, who said 500,000 kids killed in Iraq was worth it for US interests, or many other, Margaret Thatcher in Britain. The argument that we simply put a woman in charge means things will be better. Again, it gets back to your primary point, is that you have to look at the political program, not just the gender or the racial identity or the self identity, because that obscures this. And I would also, I imagine Dr. Bishop will have some questions from the chat, but one final observation I make for political science is it strikes me that from the very beginning of this country, there's been an attempt by an elite group to limit the opportunity we have to make decisions. I mean, the Bill of Rights was the result of a mass movement rejecting the Constitution without the Bill of Rights. The slavery also was part of the abolitionist movement. So I would just posit that nothing of substance has changed in this society without a mass social movement. And I would say history would, and data would support that. So it's part of where the media allows us to have a conversation, or our discipline breaks, even in the institutions that we teach in, make that conversation quite difficult. So I appreciate hearing your responses and being able to engage you in a short exchange here. So thank you very much. And I'm going to see if Dr. Bishop has some chat questions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Arts, for taking the time to do those questions, to ask those questions. And Dr. Brown, I just want you to know that the audience is certainly appreciative of your rich and expansive responses. This is a direct quote. Dr. Brown is fielding these questions like a rock star. Excellence and brilliance, and to which I replied 100%. Absolutely. We're so honored to have you here. So I do want to go ahead and encourage folks who have joined us to post your questions in the chat at any time. And I'll just start by tossing a few your way that have come in already. So this person sort of frames the question by saying, you know, let's not attack VP Harris, it's not productive. But the question is, can change be brought about by radicals only or by moderates only? Why or why not?
Yeah, I think they're going to have to work together. I don't think it's a one or the other. Right? Unfortunately, usually one party can't push through anything. They can stop things, but you can't move policy forward. So, so in order to do so, you have to get multiple people on board. And I think that there's some room. I'm optimistic during this 117th Congress that we might be able to get some movement on some big issue things that will require both moderates and radicals to work together, such as the Green New Deal, or trying to think about clean energy, affordable housing, right? These are things that are pressing problems that are facing America, and everyone agrees on that. They agree that this is a problem. They don't agree on what the solution is. And I think that's the hard work legislative negotiation comes in. I've been trying to, I do not envy the position that Speaker Pelosi is in whatsoever, right? I don't know how she's going to keep this caucus together. But progressives have very defined views on how we can bring back the economy, and in a very inclusive way. Moderates are much more reluctant to spend big money to do some of this, and also to center some of the most marginalized at the table. And so I think with those two opposing views, I'm optimistic that things will work out, particularly because there are Republicans who also believe that this is a problem, right? And so it's now just trying to figure out the best way to attack it.
Thank you for that. So this next question actually sort of harkens back to your quote from Maxine Waters early on, that we're living really in a pandemic within a pandemic. And so the question is, what does the double consciousness mentality look like for African Americans in what you, Dr. Brown, are calling the two pandemics?
Right, so it's a recognition that racism, right, kind of, is a thread through Black Americans' everyday existence, right? That there is no part of life that is not touched by their race and racism. But but what this means, or the part that I want to kind of bring to the conversation, is that it doesn't mean it's the absence of Black joy. It doesn't mean that it's the absence of Black humanity, right? That Black Americans have been dealing with racism and white supremacy, multiple forms of, of hatred and violence and vitriol, but still find reasons to smile and to have productive and enjoyable lives, even within a pandemic. So I think about the ways that the pandemic has opened up spaces for some while closing others, right? So Black women-owned businesses saw a steep decline, but then some at the beginning of the pandemic, but some more nimble, more creative businesses that were owned by Black women, and particularly Black women creatives like Issa Rae, were able to thrive, right? And I think it's, having to be able to have the two-and conversation, right? So the double conscious, like, are you Black, are you African, are you an American? But I wanted to answer this in an intentionally kind of different way, to think about, right, what are some of the good things that being Black happens? What are some of the ways that you aren't seen as the problem, right? Again, to quote Du Bois, right? And I think that while the immense suffering we saw and we lived through, or we are living through during the pandemic, there's also been some bright spots. So for some communities, it was the election of Kamala Harris. For others, it was seeing Marsha Fudge become the HUD secretary. And then for other folks, it could just be some everyday good things that are happening, whether it is Meg Thee Stallion winning a Grammy, right? Whether it's seeing the joy that Beyonce had when she was awarding her that award. It could be some very, very basic things like, I hit some weight goals, or I, perfected my, my grandmother's pound cake recipe all during the pandemic. So I just want to throw that out there as that it's not all a woe is me story, but that there are chances and opportunities for Black folks to experience joy in this time.
I agree with that 100%. So this next, this is sort of a two-parter, and it's from one of our PNW political scientists, Dr. Meg Brinker. And the first part of her question is, are you seeing new patterns of candidate recruitment among Black women, from local to state to federal, or perhaps in the other direction?
Okay, so first, hey Meg, that's another friend that I said I saw in the audience. And so, unfortunately, no, right? I guess I have a pessimistic answer, Meg. So before the pandemic became a full thing, we did some focus groups in Texas with women who are running for myriad of offices, from statewide elected office to local city councils and judgeships. And a recurring theme for most of these women were that there just wasn't the recruitment infrastructure present. Now, some of this, right, could be it's Texas, right? It's red because of voter suppression and gerrymandering, but it's also pretty deeply rooted in some, what I find in this work is politics of respectability, right? So Black folks also policing other Black folks. And so if Black women are running in minority districts, they're having to kind of kiss the ring of a kingmaker or a queenmaker. Some of them look like them in the Democratic Party. And that poses challenges, particularly to millennial women and Gen Z women who are trying to run. And it also pitted some of the women in the focus group against some of their own interests, against each other, right? So some of the women in the focus groups were the Democratic Party chair in their county, and they were talking to other women, like basically not extending the same kind of olive branch or trying to help recruit them. And so, again, to like have this much more nuanced view, it's not just, oh, poo-poo the party or poo-poo white folks, right? Sometimes that you could poo-poo Black folks, right? And particularly some Black women. But what all of the people in the study have uniformly said, I think with an exception of one, and this is a woman that I've studied, but this one woman in Missouri, in St. Louis, Missouri, has really shared that it takes a sponsor. It takes someone with political power to sponsor you, to say, I'm going to introduce you to networks, I'm going to help you get started. And that, unfortunately, is something that most Black women do not have.
That's very important. And a little a bit of a relationship to this next, the two-parter, the second part of Professor Rinker's question. It seems that your intersectional lens is challenging traditional notions in poli-sci literature of a quality challenger, someone who has held political office before as the only relevant experience. Can you comment?
So the quality question, that's something that I get asked often, but mostly by reporters who really want me to use political science scholarship to be able to share that these women are quality. But the thing that I tried to push back on or try to showcase is that particularly women and women of color are usually the ones that get asked that question. We just lived through 4 years of a presidency of a person who never held elected office, who was not asked the same kind of intense quality questions, but instead was able to parlay business expertise or supposed business expertise into being able to run a government, even though these are two completely different entities. And women get asked those questions even when they've run for office, right? Even when they've been successful. It's like, okay, I saw you did this great job as city council, but now you're running for the state legislature. Tell me why I should vote for you, right? This is the kind of degree that women get asked. And it's because as a society, right, we hold these stereotypical views that women are caretakers, that they're nurturers, that they're people who are better outside of the political system. But new scholarship has shown that when women are viewed as politicians, voters sometimes will remove those blinders and will think about them as politicians. But usually that's referred mostly to white women, right? Like the scholarship on Black women. I'm referring to work by Brooks. The scholarship on Black women hasn't found the same thing.
So you sort of mentioned the previous administration in that response, and this next question definitely invokes the previous administration. Do you think the new party Trumplican is a problem with different communities? And why do you think red states are making new laws? And do you think that this new sort of push for legislation is sort of previewing the second coming of Jim Crow?
Yes, yes. I don't think it's the second coming of Jim Crow. I think it's a continuation of Jim Crow, particularly right when we look at the large numbers of Black folks that are already ineligible to vote because of felonies on their records or being caught up in the criminal justice system. And those are all by design as well, right? It's not that Black Americans are more prone to behave in felony manners that lead themselves to being felonies, but that felonies were put on the books as crimes that a lot of legislators thought Blacks were more likely to commit. And so, right, all of this is baked into the system. And what I am at least more hopeful this time around is that some of these things that state legislatures are doing to try to roll back voting expansions are being called out for what they are. It's not, so all voters, so survey data has shown that voters, both Republicans and Democrats, fear voter fraud, right? This is a serious issue that both parties see. However, one party thinks that there is more voter fraud and the other party thinks that there is like voter fraud is an issue. We should address it when it happens, but it's not a writ large problem. And in actuality, it isn't, right? Like voter fraud happens in a minuscule percentage of the time. And most times it's people that are voting by mistake or didn't know that they hadn't updated their registration rate. But we are one of the only Western democratic nations that doesn't have affirmative voting. And because of that, right, these situations where Jim Crow or Jane Crow will be allowed to rear its head. And so that will enable, of course, right, an administration who prioritizes a less democratic or more authoritarian view to what American politics should look like. So unfortunately, I do believe that if these state governments are able to pass these restrictive voting rights or voting laws, particularly in the absence of proof, right? Like we are going to see some really dire consequences for communities of color, for queer folks, for women, right? Women are oftentimes left out of this conversation. If women who get married and change their name are often one of the biggest people that are purged from roles because they might be registered under their maiden name or their driver's license might not, their new married name might not match up to the name on the roll. So we don't talk about it in those ways. So it's not just pulling restrictions to Black folks, right? Kind of the thing that we think most presently when we're thinking about Jim Crow, but there are other groups that will be affected by these restrictive voting policies too.
So I just want to encourage folks, we have Dr. Brown for just a few more minutes, and I do have a few questions, but if they're remaining, but if there is a burning question on your mind, please go ahead and post now in the chat. So switching gears just a little bit, I'm wondering, you and Sisters in the State House talk a lot about, and you mentioned this a little earlier when you said, you know, you're not trying to reduce these experiences to zeros and ones, not that data is not important, but you do a fantastic job of collecting these narratives, these really rich identity narratives. Can you take us behind the scenes a little bit? What was it like? You know, give us a story, share some inside poop on, like, what was it like meeting with these women and gathering these stories?
Yeah, so I'm a qualitative researcher. I didn't recognize that as I came out of graduate school because most political scientists are not trained to talk to people. Indeed, I was not. But I was told that I am good at talking to people by my dissertation advisor. She said, don't worry, just go down, you can do it. And so that's what happened. But one of the stories I can share that really, I think, in some ways changed my trajectory were two things. One, I started doing research in the Maryland State Legislature, and I asked, I did all the proper protocol that I thought I was supposed to follow. I sent an email, I sent formal letters, and I asked for interviews. I only got 3, and then, which were not enough for dissertation. And then I sat outside the office of the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I think her staffer took pity on me and invited me inside. So she saw me eating a peanut butter sandwich and drinking water from a recycled water bottle that I kept filling up in the hallway water fountain. And she said, this poor baby is hungry and she needs us to help her. And she pulled me in the office, she gave me lunch, and she introduced me to her her member of the state legislature. And the state legislature said, well, come on with me, baby. And she held me by the hand and pulled me down into the Congressional Black Caucus meeting room where they were getting ready to have a meeting. And she stood up and said, this little girl is here to do a project on us. Everyone, meet with her, talk to her, get your staffers, get your schedulers to find time to meet with her. And that's really what started my project, right? Was someone, right, who saw me eating a peanut butter sandwich outside an office, who was like, yeah, this poor kid needs some help. And then since then, I've cultivated those relationships with legislators. But I'll say this, right? My work with legislators, I don't, particularly Black women legislators, is mediated through my own identity as a Black woman. Right. I think that being able to understand kind of the ways in which Black women talk to each other, I recognized, that being called baby was a term of endearment. It was not, some way to kind of diminish my standing as a researcher. Right. And that she was generally trying to help me. I didn't take offense to being fed, right, when I was a poor grad student, and having a hot meal is really good as opposed to the peanut butter sandwich. But it was just like a different way of interacting, right? And I doubt that, some of the same kind of interactions would have happened if I were not a Black woman. So that really started my own research. But there have been so many instances where legislators have told me things that are just eye-opening. One legislator told me when she was sworn in to be the Speaker pro temp that her husband said, he didn't want to be Mr. So-and-so. He wanted to stand on his own 2 feet. And so he said, get your brother, have him hold the Bible. I want a divorce. And you're like, that is mind-boggling, right? Another woman talked to me about her husband was okay with her running for office as long as food was cooked and there were meals on the table every day. And so she was doing these kind of double duties. So along with those like kind of really awful stories, I've heard stories of women who shared with me that they get stopped in Target by kids who want to talk to them and tell them how impressed they are with politics and that they want to be politicians. Particularly little Black boys and girls who say, man, if you could be on the city council, right? If you're on the school board, if you're a judge, right? Can you come and speak to my class? Can you talk with us? So some of those stories have really, really been uplifting, right? It's opening the eyes of what younger generations think is possible for them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being so transparent and sharing that. I feel like I was there with you on the steps. So 2 last questions, and these are really more student-centric. One, how does the panelist feel? This came from someone in the chat who wants to know your take on graduation ceremonies by some of the Ivy Leagues that have been reserved for Black students. And I'm so tempted to jump in here, but I know you are very adept at setting the record straight, so I will just.
Yeah, so that's also, right, a big misnomer in how it's been picked up in social media land and by conservative outlets, that these are community celebrations for folks that have already been engaged in that community for the 4 years while they were on campus and want to celebrate themselves and their own. And it's not exclusionary, that if you are friends with someone who's taking part of that ceremony, you can attend and are welcome to. It's not a closed off. It's really inclusive, but it's a space that's been cultivated over 4 years for however long that person's been on the campus, for people who usually deal with microaggressions and prejudice and discrimination in a majority campus. I went to Howard University, a historically Black college university, so we didn't have that. My first time attending one of these ceremonies was in graduate school, and it was a very affirming and warm space, but it was also inclusive.
Yes, and no degrees are conferred. It is really a
Yeah.
celebration. It is not a graduation.
No, it's just a ceremony to celebrate. That's it.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so last question. It's actually sort of a two-parter. I think students would be really interested in hearing just sort of what your inspiration, what led you to political science, who were your role models, or who are your role models now? Just sort of speak to maybe the students in our audience and leave them with a word.
Sure. So I knew I wanted to be a political scientist in the 4th grade. That is probably unlike most people, right? But I watched my grandfather, who fled Jim Crow violence in South Carolina, relocated to New York and then later to New Jersey, and he made my brother and I watch Mayor David Dinkins being sworn as the first and only Black mayor of New York City, and that for me just transformed my worldview. I was just like, whoa, this is unbelievable. And I grew up hearing stories about the kind of opportunities he wanted for my brother and I, because he didn't have them, right? He had a 3rd grade education because of segregation and Jim Crow and violence. And I knew I wanted to do something. And for me, it was teaching and research. So I think everyone has a unique calling, but how I want to make my difference in the world is teaching students how to think, not teaching them what to think, but giving them the tools to learn how to think for themselves and to be critical consumers of knowledge, and as well as being producers of knowledge. And I'm thankful for that little spark that that someone kind of cultivated. I had no idea what a professor did. And I'm sure many other professors also had no idea before they had no idea what professors did, right? But the ability for me to write books on Black women political elites has really been part of what my life's purpose is. And I think for students, if you find out the thing that you can't live without, the thing that keeps you awake at night, the thing that you think about constantly, it's usually this through line from what you were passionate about when you were a child to now. And it's kind of closing off all those other voices that will say, oh, you don't want to go to graduate school, or you won't make any money doing that, right? But if you are truly passionate about this, it won't leave your, it won't leave your essence. It won't leave your brain. It'll draw you back. And that's what politics did for me. I thought I was going to be a politician myself. I thought maybe I'd be a lawyer because I thought that's how you became a politician. But when I got to college campus, I'm home. I'm never leaving. And it's been 20 years and I've never left. And so I think for students, again, just cultivate whatever that kernel is inside of you that gets you up in the morning that you want to do to make the world a better place.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Nadia E. Brown. Folks in the chat are just expressing their gratitude. You are truly an inspiration, and it will be so sad to say goodbye to you in July 2021 as you head off to Georgetown as Professor of Government and Director of the Women's and Gender Studies program. But we are just so thrilled to have had a piece of you today, and we look forward to seeing all of the wonderful work that you will continue to produce. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I would just like to plug our final installment of the series. It's Monday, April 19th with Dr. Meeta Chowdhury, the 1619 Project and the Summer of 2020. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Nadia E. Brown from Purdue University, West Lafayette, thank you again for your time.